Hi, everyone, and welcome along to the Digital Culture Ideas Show. It's so great to have you today. As you know, this is the show where we talk about one of the biggest cultural shifts happening right now, which is a shift towards a more digital business and life. So it's all about how technology and the internet is changing the way we make decisions, think, behave, and communicate. And with me today, I'm very excited to have Lloyd Evans, who leads LogMeIn's ANZ team. And a bit about Lloyd before we start. When he's not training for his next ultra marathon, Lloyd enables organisations to elevate their security posture while saving money and time. And one of the really key products that we're keen to have a chat about today is LastPass and password managers in general. So Lloyd, how are you and what's happening for you at the moment?
Thanks, Hilary. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to your audience on digital cultural ideas today. Really thank you for that. We love the opportunity to talk about password management generally, and then obviously LogMeIn and LastPass. I think for us, and we sort of talked about this before, recently World Password Day is a big sort of milestone event for us globally, and we're super pumped to talk about password management generally. We've obviously seen of late a lot of advice around password management through the New Zealand government, through Cert New Zealand, and also through the ACSC here in Australia. So we're always happy to talk through that. And I suppose how password management links back to the topic that you talked about as people move and shift to digital. What does that mean for people, and how do they manage, their cyber posture and identity better, both at home and at work?
Absolutely. So yeah, 6th of May for everyone who's listening was World Password Day. So there was quite a bit of press around password managers and passwords around that time. And obviously, this is a really important thing that people just, are still getting to grips with even now. So hence why a whole kind of show on this, because it is actually really interesting, password managers in particular, but then also why people aren't using them. So keen to get into that.
Sure.
But before we do, Lloyd, I think it'd be really helpful for the audience to give some context to who you are and tell us a bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, sure. So I've been with LogMeIn for about 4 years. I run our industry vertical team here, which focuses around healthcare, financial services, government, technology, and education. So K-12 is one of my focus areas. Prior to that, I ran our higher education portfolio here at LastPass LogMeIn, and also the financial services portfolio here as well. My, I suppose, career background, I used to work at a company called SolarWinds. People may be aware of that, so I did a couple of years there. And so I've been focused around sort of cybersecurity and cyber posture for that period. And then in a prior life, I worked in financial services for 10 years, sort of corporate banker. Outside of that, obviously personally, just I've got children, and so I'm super passionate about keeping kids cyber safe, I suppose, both at school, home, and in their careers as they move through to the workforce. And as you touched on, yes, I do run quite a bit, and so it's a big passion of mine. I actually have a race coming up this weekend, so wish me luck.
Oh, absolutely. Best of luck, and good on you as well. So interesting kind of story how we met, Lloyd. Really kind of serendipitous, really. So I was posting about an article that came out in New Zealand from, NZ Cert, and it was their director, Rob Pope, and he was talking about this real password apathy with New Zealanders still. In fact, I think there was a stat in there which was really shocking. They said only 31% of people actually change their password when they've had an attack, which is just pretty nuts to me. But, the reason you contacted me, and then we kind of got into this, and I think it's a really important conversation to have. So not just because it's World Password Day, we should have these conversations all the time, but because, I think it's something that people are still grappling with. So can you give me your kind of 101 on why you think passwords are really important, and whether you think people are doing a good job of that right now?
Yeah, so I think if we sort of take a step back, if we go back to like the 1960s, I'm going to go back a little bit further. So let me just hear me out for a minute. But back in the 1960s, there was a professor at MIT who developed the first password. Now, since then, there's been iterations and people trying to move away from passwords since that date. But the reality is, even though Bill Gates called for the death of passwords in 2004, the reality is we still have the problem today. And so although we talk about passwordless authentication, the reality is passwords are still the easiest way to authenticate for most applications, both at home and at work. The statistic was interesting that came from CERT New Zealand, and if you look at their top 10 critical controls, they did update that to include password management recently on top of MFA, so multi-factor authentication. And so there's a couple of things with that. I think that a lot of companies have sort of thought about how do they consolidate the risk of passwords, manage passwords better using things like single sign-on and MFA, but the reality is breaches are still occurring because of passwords, either weak reused or third-party compromised credentials. And that statistic around even after a data breach, people still don't reset it. I think that really comes down to human issue, right? Human behavioral issues and cognitive dissonance around managing credentials. The reality is that most people these days, and from our research at LastPass, have about 191 passwords to remember. And so there's only really a few ways that you can kind of manage that in a work capacity and or home capacity, and is use something like a password manager to automate that and store it securely for you. And I think the problem, to that point, is that people don't reset it because it's problematic. It's too hard to have to remember a new complex password that either aligns to a NIST standard or some sort of security management ISM type of arrangement that either the government's pushing down on or through CERT New Zealand or the ACS is an example from a government standpoint. So I think it's difficult from a behavioural issue point of view to get people to manage passwords better.
Yeah, that's true. And I think sometimes I think one of the cop-outs for people is they sort of worry about the security of password managers itself. So instead of using a password manager, they kind of think, oh, I'm just going to, stick with my kind of 3 different passwords, one really strong one maybe for my really serious accounts, like my banking, maybe my government kind of logins for IRD, a kind of medium kind of password for something that's mildly important, maybe their online grocery shopping, and then a kind of low-grade password for maybe just, social media or whatever it is. And so I think there's a bit of a cop-out there because they go, oh, but, all your eggs in one basket, that can't be safe. I'll just stick with what I think is, my good recipe over here for password management.
Yeah, and I mean, that comes up a lot. I get a lot of questions around, the security of password managers and how do they stay secure and the rest of it. And I can obviously talk to our solution. We run a zero knowledge security model. I won't get into the technical aspect of that, but the reality is even if people try and remember it, what tends to happen is because they have so many passwords, not even just outside banking, government accounts or home shopping accounts, there tends to be a common theme around how they try and remember passwords or create them. And a lot of that is personal information. It could be a child's name, it could be a birth date. And a lot of that information is actually publicly available on things like social media accounts and Facebook. And you'd be surprised at the amount of information that a criminal can gather on someone individually to profile them to hack into an account. And I've heard multiple stories of this, of C-level executives who have had their social media account credentials stolen, and because they're reusing them across a work environment, they get broken into, and that obviously flows on. We talk about this a lot. There is especially with the move to working remote during the pandemic and COVID, there is a significant blurred line between how people are managed security at home and how does that relate back to the work environment, especially when it comes to passwords and credentials, because it's a lot of it is interlinked at the moment.
Yeah, that's true. You mentioned people who use their kids' names or family names and passwords, and actually last year I wrote an article around your password personality, and that was one of the personalities. So people who use their kids' names. Another one was people who get really fanatical or are fans of something. So it might be like their favorite music band or sporting team, or even kind of music stars as well. So apparently Homer and Madonna were 2 of the most popular kind of fan passwords, according to some of the research I did. I'm sure you've got some other research on that anyway, but I think Definitely. It rings true.
Well, in the UK in particular, Liverpool, I think was the most common breach password over the last couple of years, and obviously not that very strong because people were able to skim it, and that's the reality is that people struggle with managing credentials and passwords, and so having something to give to them at work or at home, to protect their identity that automates that process for them, it makes it long and complex. One, it makes it difficult for a criminal to be able to socially profile them to figure out what their passwords could be, especially if they're reusing them, and just buys down the risk that it relates to compromised credentials. I mean, in Australia in particular, there is a report that gets produced by the Australian government, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, that has been produced for 3 years, called the Notifiable Data Breach Report. And basically every time that report comes out, between 60 to 70% of the reasons why companies are getting compromised here in this country is because of credentials, weak reused or they're phished, right? And that's pretty common across the world. And we just think that people should be focusing their attention on that risk and buying that down, using things like password managers.
Yeah, that's so interesting, that report, because over in New Zealand, we've just changed our privacy laws to sort of catch up with the Australian ones. And so we have a similar notifiable breach process. So it'll be really interesting. So that came in 1st of December 2020. When we hit kind of a year's time, it'd be interesting to see the New Zealand report and see if credentials comes up there again. I imagine it will. So
I think so, and interestingly, this is a global trend. It's not even Australia, New Zealand. Singapore's recently announced a data breach legislation, and in the prior 3 months, it's tripled the amount of breaches that have occurred in Singapore because it's notifiable now. It's not people just, putting it under the cover, so to speak. And we've seen that, and it's human error. Like, it's issues with human error, which for the most part relate to credentials.
Yeah. At Cordia, we do a really interesting piece of research. It's an annual piece as well. And we talk to business leaders in New Zealand. It is Kiwi focused. We talk to them about their cybersecurity practices. And a couple of the results that we found were that while cybersecurity is in the media and it's all over the place, and apparently directors and things like that are worried about it, 2 in 5 organizations didn't have policies or training to prevent cyber breaches. So, and that we've found that year on year, that result is worryingly decreasing. So less organizations are having the right training and the right policies in place. And also only half of employees were confident that they understood good password practice. So it's really kind of a slap in the face for security professionals like you and I. Like, people that just, I don't know, maybe they don't have skin in the game with security around work. But then in saying that, they're not doing these good practices personally either. But yeah, this human factor piece is fascinating, worryingly fascinating. As a psychologist and a security professional, it's something I think about a lot. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting because I think a lot of companies, I mean, from a board perspective, right, I think a lot of people are becoming more aware of what's happening. I think it's really around how do they prioritize and how do they make sure that their staff are keeping the company secure. And so what a lot of companies will do is they'll say, hey, we want to comply with a certain legislation or compliance regime. We'll push out a password policy and we'll kind of keep our fingers crossed and kind of hope for the best and make sure that staff stay secure and protected. One company out of the US, I won't mention them, but basically they align their KPIs directly to security-related issues, so either cyber awareness, and so a lot of the staff, actually all of the staff, are tied to security, right? And a lot of that has come from sort of top down, from a CEO level. I think the thing that comes up for me, for the most part, you talked about sort of the behavioural and the psychology behind it. I think for a lot of staff, it just doesn't impact them, right? Like, deploying things like a firewall to keep safe in a company doesn't really impact them personally. How does that relate back to them? And I think that is a trend that we're starting to see at LastPass, is really, how do we help keep our staff cyber secure? I mean, we're concerned about their health and safety, right? We care about them not picking up a box or, sitting ergonomically in a chair, but how does that relate back to cyber posture? And so a lot of the work that we do with companies is really around how do we help staff at home, how do we help their family, how do we help their kids, and manage things like passwords better, privacy settings better, and those sort of things, which I think it's super important to tie it back to the individual as opposed to just a corporate stance around, hey, we've got a password policy, you've got to keep it 16 characters long, good luck with that, and don't really allow them to, manage it better. I think it's just a poor stance, really. I don't think it's really thinking through the full process of what actually has to take place.
No. And Lloyd, in conversations we've had previously, you've mentioned a couple of things which I'm going to probably steal your thunder on, potentially, but there's a couple of really great analogies you had around this, and one was around, we wear seatbelts in a car from a safety perspective. Well, actually, probably our passwords or our password managers are like our seatbelts when we're dealing with the world online. I loved that. And then there was another one you mentioned around, what was it? It was around the way we manage health or government messages around health.
Yeah, well, I think, interesting to sort of talk about that. So the conversation we had before around seatbelts, like we had this massive push to wear seatbelts in cars because we knew it was good for our health and our safety when we're protected driving a vehicle. I think the same thing really has to happen with cybersecurity. I'm super passionate about it, as you can probably tell, and you can see that comes through in a lot of my messaging. The evidence from the government. So we care about the government protecting us from a health perspective. When I think about COVID and the vaccination side of things, especially with Jacinta and, I said maybe to a less extent Scott Morrison, but, we care about the way that they are trying to help us stay safe from a COVID perspective. Then if the evidence and the advice that they're providing us, especially for Cert New Zealand as an example, that the top 10 critical controls are things to help us stay safe and secure, why don't we listen to that, but we listen to details around our health, which is kind of strange. That feels a bit odd to me. The other one that we tend to use here a little bit, I'm stealing someone else's thunder, but, criminals hackers aren't hacking in, they're just logging in. The reason for that is because people are using weak credentials. Not to fly off with all the analogies, but the seatbelt one is a good one. I think it's easy for people to comprehend and understand. And linking back from a health and safety perspective, LogMeIn as an example, provide us with health insurance for all of the employees. But guess what? They also provide us with a password manager to use at home for myself and my family as well. So those sort of things that our company does to help us stay secure, I think is just it should be a bigger trend for companies to start thinking about that, because gone are the days where the perimeter of the office is the castle, so to speak. We're effectively moved to a home office environment for most of us, and it's really about staying secure anywhere we work, not just in the office or at home as well.
Yeah, that's so true. And I'm really pleased you brought that up, because I have noticed that just recently as well with the conversations I've had around password managers. And I'd done a presentation around cybersecurity and password practice, and someone came up afterwards and they were like, why don't organizations offer password managers as part of the benefits package, part of the well-being for staff? And I was like, actually, that's a really brilliant idea. So have you looked and have you done any research around that or looked into that? Is that something new that you're thinking about, or is it kind of you've been thinking about that for a while and you're really keen to see it happen?
We do that all the time, and we have been doing it for a number of years. And so not to get into kind of the product push, but when we deploy LastPass Enterprise to customers, we offer a service called Premium as a perk, which is a personal password manager for staff to use at home. And so we have seen a massive trend towards that of late, and even in the past, right? It's something we've been doing for years. And a lot of our customers actually embed that process as part of an onboarding experience. So as you sign up for, to work at a new employer, then, hey, you get your health package, you get your cyber package, and this is kind of the stuff that forms as part of that. Password management plays a part in that. Cybersecurity, it might not be everything that they do, but yes, we've been doing that for quite a while. A lot of companies have adopted that sort of stance. From my experience, a lot of financial service companies as well as higher education. So if you think about staff and students now at the moment with COVID aren't really on campus. And so, ways to protect them off campus is super important. And that's something we've been doing with higher ed, but also K-12 as well, education. So, as I said before, keeping both, children obviously cyber safe at school. They're using new technology all the time. They're using tablets and things to get work done. That's I'm super passionate about that, obviously as a father, but also just protecting, students when they're working remote.
Yeah, likewise. I think that whole cyber safe parenting thing is another really important kind of cybersecurity topic to talk about. And actually, maybe we can have a chat about that now. So I have quite young children. They're like 4, 6, and 8. We're kind of at that end of the scale. And my 8-year-old came up to me the other day and he said, Mummy, I thought of a really good password. I was like, oh, what is it? He said, it's password. They will never guess that, will they? I couldn't believe it. I almost fell off my chair as a cybersecurity professional. I was like, oh, but it just kind of shows this is how human brains are wired. And then it's made me think I've got to start talking about or thinking about maybe introducing a password manager. But how old is the right age? How young is too young? How do you work that out? Have you got any research around that, Lloyd?
Yeah, I mean, we've dealt with a lot of government agencies, especially departments of education. So we've had a lot of conversations around this, around what advice is good advice around people using or kids using password managers. I think these days, even from my perspective, I'm a bit long in the tooth, but when I went back to when I was in school, I didn't have things like mobile phones and tablets and things to do my work on. And so the digital literacy of kids now is a lot younger. My youngest, who's very young, can still unlock my phone, and he's like 14, 15 months, right? So as kids are getting more used to using technologies in schools, I think it's important to start thinking about what is best practice for them. Now, I think it's important to highlight that, like your son said, hey, like this is a good password, and it's about educating him around, okay, what is a good password, what's not a good password, but hey, here's some things to use to help manage that. And it could be a password manager, as we talked about before. I think anything younger than sort of 7, I probably wouldn't bother introducing it. It may be better to use maybe like a diary, like a locked diary with a little key or something like that, to manage that better as a child. But as they grow up, I think in the past the age would have been a lot higher, right? A lot of people maybe sort of starting high school if they get used to using technology like tablets and so forth. But these days, like a lot of the work that they do, and sort of reflecting back on COVID, they were using video conferencing tools that needed passwords to log into the environment for the school. And so having to remember that or write it down, making sure that it's secure is super important, because it has access to all the information that they probably have around their schooling, could have parent information on it. And so, when I've spoken to the Department of Education areas in the past, it's sort of been around that age of around 7 is typically when people are getting used to using things like tablets and digital platforms for school, things like that.
But what about, we know that, with password managers, so it's got one long and strong password that you need to remember. And if you forget it, you can kind of get it back, but it's a real pain. So you need to remember that password. What if the 7-year-old forgets that password? What do I do as a parent?
So there is capacity for us to help with that or manage that. Under our family package, there are other ways to be able to share passwords for them to log into applications. So effectively the parent would control the username and password for an app for the school, as an example, share that password with their child, and basically all the child has to do is launch the application. You control the underlying login credentials. So there is a way to do that, almost like a parental control. But it is a good point, right? I think it's starting to think about, well, all you need to do is remember one password and the application will do the rest of the work for you is super important. The other thing I would suggest is, if the child is using a mobile phone, then layering on multi-factor would be, I think, a wise decision for any password manager, not necessarily LastPass, but any password manager as well.
Yeah, okay. And then the other thing I think about, and I know that I've had discussions with people and I've sort of got my own view, but sometimes in a relationship, there's kind of one person who takes the burden in terms of setting up a lot of the electronics and the accounts and, that kind of thing. And I'm probably that person in the relationship with my husband. So this is not a product sale at all, but if I pass away, then my husband's going to be like, oh my gosh, I don't know any passwords to things. So I'm guessing password managers like LastPass have that kind of facility for helping when that happens.
Yeah, and look, it's a little bit, I suppose, a little bit morbid conversation, but I think it's important to think about, right? As our digital lives, on your podcast, right? When we're talking about that increase in the use of digital technology, what is happening is the rate of people using cloud services, applications at home, work, personal life, whatever it might be, is exploding, right? And the underlying risk with that is that people have tons of username and passwords. So I think it's important to think about, well, how do, as a couple, and, I've got a partner, it's, touch wood, if I pass away, how would they get access to that sort of environment? And so, through LastPass and things like that, it's really about sharing those credentials amongst the family so that potentially everyone has access to it. And there is an ability to be able to recoup those access points should, worst case situation, one of the people passed away. And I think that's a good strategy to think about longer term. Probably no different than, having a will, right? It's not that much different. Your digital life is on the internet. It's not really yours anymore. And, we've heard stories about this where, I've got a friend that I went to high school with. Unfortunately, he passed away, and a lot of his personal photos were on Facebook, and the parents couldn't get it back because they couldn't access his account, right? Because the identity sat with him, which is sad, right? That's an unfortunate situation, and the parents had to go through this process of requesting access to the account to, grab that information off the social media platform, and it took them months. Like it shouldn't be that hard. But yeah, that was a pretty sad example, but one I think people should be aware of.
Absolutely, and it's certainly something I've thought about. My mother passed away a number of years ago, but I was the one who kind of inherited all these physical albums and photos from her past. And as I was receiving them, I was thinking, gosh, all of mine are digital, so how's that going to work? So, and I would say that people need to think about this not longer term, but actually probably now, because we don't know what's going to happen, particularly in this kind of crazy world that we're living in at the moment. So
definitely,
that's the second thing I need to look into: family sharing, and then also how I'm going to manage those situations to make sure I'm set up for success.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so where are you, and what are you looking forward to next, Lloyd? Or what are you and LogMeIn looking forward to, or LastPass? What's coming up next?
Well, I think we spoke about this before. We're pretty excited about all the events that we can attend now. Like, we're obviously in Australia, it's opened up a little bit, and so we're running a lot of events within our industry vertical. So legal, in particular, is coming up. We've got a couple of events coming up in Sydney and Melbourne. I've got a team of people up in AusCert on the Gold Coast at the moment, talking about password managers. And look, our message really hasn't changed in the last 10 years. LastPass has been around for 10 years. The message really hasn't changed, which is sort of depressing in a way, but the opportunity is still there to help people. And that's really continuing, right? It's really about the education around using things like password managers, because I think a lot of companies in particular have sort of said, the advice from government agencies, CERT, New Zealand, or the ACSC was things like, hey, use multi-factor authentication, use single sign-on, and that'll help with the credential problem, the password problem that we see. But the facts are that that hasn't worked, and we're still here today. We still, every single year, we get the same worst passwords come out. It's like the top 10, the dirty dozen, or even dirty dozen, as I like to call it. They're the same passwords. They're getting rehashed all the time. And there's a gap that exists because if you think about the general technology stack for most companies, they will use some sort of Active Directory to sort of manage credentials, but there's so many other applications that get used in an environment that aren't captured under that. And so that gap exists, and that leaves people and companies vulnerable to exploit. So that for us is continuing. It doesn't really change too much. But I am super passionate about getting the message out about using password managers, and especially from a educational point of view for kids. But the other thing I am also, what we sort of talked about was, linking it back to cyber safety and how does that relate back to how you would help a staff member from a health and safety point of view, right? I don't really see that there's any difference between the two. And the other thing that tends to come up with us is, a lot of people will deploy, it to a unique situation within an environment, but, maybe deploy it to just the IT team as an example. But the reality is, like, the use case is there for everybody. An example that I typically use is, if you've got a house with 10 windows, why would you give a password manager to 3 people in your office, but you've left the other 7 windows wide open? Because it's still a risk element, right? So that comes up a lot. We like to talk about that. But we're still passionate about it. I think there's still a great opportunity for us as a business, but also just, helping Australians and New Zealanders and obviously across APAC for us. We're super excited about that. The other couple of areas that I would like to talk about is that, we talked about the notifiable data breach report, and there's obviously a similar report coming out in New Zealand. That is a global trend. It's happened in Singapore. India is in a similar process. They're probably just starting that journey, but we'll continue to see that same process sort of roll out globally. I think that as companies move to more digital ways of working, both at home and at work, obviously in a hybrid environment, this risk around privacy and controlling data is going to continue. And one of the easiest ways to reduce that risk is through, password managers and reducing the risk of someone entering a business through a weak password. That's kind of my stake in the ground, I suppose, Hilary.
Yeah. Oh, and what a good stake. Oh, and that's absolutely my message as well. If you're not using a password manager now, or you haven't sort of set it up properly, now is absolutely the time to do that. Do it for yourself. Do it for your family, because actually you've probably got, like as Lloyd said, that 200 personal apps and maybe only a small number of work ones. So it's super important. You need to learn how to do it. There are some great resources and videos in terms of how to set them up. Choose whatever one is super user friendly for you. Ask a couple of friends. But these days they can sync on your phone, across as a browser plugin in your on your computer and your tablet, and they just sync up. And so you've got all the passwords you need whenever you need them. So my call to action, and I'm sure it's Lloyd's as well, is just use a password manager. So important. Thanks so much, Lloyd, for coming on the show. It's been amazing to have you on.
No, thank you.
And what a great conversation as well, and on an important topic. So thanks so much, Lloyd. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.